So I'm going to give us a talk in this series, The Path in the Buddha's Experience, just looking at, incidents from the Buddha's life, aspects of the Buddha's life and how they're relevant to us in our own spiritual lives, or could be relevant to us in our own spiritual lives. And tonight's talk is called The Need for Commitment. The Need for Commitment. So, yeah, off we go. So I'm going to start with a story of my life. A very significant thing happened to me. I'm quite old. So, there's a lot of significant things that happened, but this one happened over 40 years ago. It was December 1983. Some of you weren't even born, I'm sure. Some of you were. And the significant thing that happened in my life was I went into an antique shop in Spring Road, Ipswich. I was living in Spring Road in Ipswich at the time, and I went into a small antique shop off the street. Ding, the little bell goes. So I walk in, and I paid about £15, which was quite a lot of money back then in 1983, for a tiny little Buddha rupa made of ceramic. And it was in the style called Satsuma. I know that's a kind of tangerine, but that is literally called that. You can look it up on the internet. Satsuma is a particular decorated style of ceramic Buddha. And I'd seen it in the window and I thought, I'm going to have it. I'd just been paid. I thought, I'm going to have that. And I took it home, bought it, and I built my first Buddhist shrine at home with the intention of meditating in front of it every day. And I have done, actually. I haven't got that rupa anymore. I don't even know where it is. I think I might have given it away, probably. I've got another one now, but I've continued that practice ever since. And what had happened was I'd just come from my very first Triratna retreat, a place called Padmaloka in Norfolk, men's retreat centre. And that was the first week I'd ever been on retreat properly in Triratna. And it changed my life. It had a really, really big effect on my life. And so when I got home, I thought, right, I'm going to look out for a Buddhist rupa. Surprisingly, there were no garden centres in those days, and you could just find Buddha rupas anywhere, like you can now. So you had to really look out, but quite quickly I spotted one in the window of the antique shop. But that was a really, really big moment for me. And I'll tell you why, because I actually got involved in Buddhism when I was 13 3/4. And I'm like Adrian Mole, Yeah, I really was 13 3/4, 50 years ago. And and this might sound pretty strange, but I do actually think that I was involved in Buddhism in a previous existence. And I realized that when I was 13 3/4. But I didn't really commit myself. I just spent 10 years messing about with Tibetan Buddhism, visiting Zen temples, all sorts of things. I was just doing that, mixed in with all the other things that teenagers do. And I certainly did that. And but after this retreat, aged 24, which is what I was, I thought, right, I'm actually going to do something about this. I'm going to commit myself. I'm going to make a commitment to practice Buddhism, because I think the momentum of the previous existence was kind of running out. Yeah, I was a Buddhist, but I wasn't doing anything new about that. I wasn't really practicing, and I needed to do that. So that was a significant moment for me. As I say, in this series, we're talking about the need for commitment and looking at significant acts of commitment in the life of the Buddha and how that's relevant to our path. And I'm covering some of the same ground that Kulapriya covered last week. He was talking quite a lot about context of the life of the Buddha. Well, I'm covering some of that ground as well, but in a different way from Kula Priya's excellent talk. All right, so I've got a little dictionary definition of commitment. So this is from my Oxford Mini Dictionary. Number one, it says the state or quality of being dedicated to a cause, activity, etc. Number two, an engagement or obligation that restricts freedom of action. I thought that was a bit odd. Anyway, we all know what commitment means. We know what it means, don't we? And we know the value of it. Any kind of decent human life, you've got to make commitments, haven't you? If you decide to get married or have a civil partnership, it's a commitment, you know, and you get the benefits of doing that. If you want to be involved in some kind of charity kind of work, well, you've got to make a commitment to it, and then it kind of works out well. If you're a parent, you've got kids, you've got to bring them up, well, it's a commitment, and it's got its rewards, and it needs that. In my case, I'm looking after a very elderly, demented parent, so I'm committed to looking after Dad till he's no longer here. I've got to do it. Yeah, if you want to pay your rent or your mortgage on time, you've got to be committed. So yeah, we know what commitment's about. We do it. Well, even if you just want to learn to play the guitar or something like that, something I always wanted to do but never did. But I did learn to play the harmonica, but that's a whole other story. I was committed to it. But it's the same with Dharma life. If you want to get anywhere with the spiritual life, you've got to make some sort of commitment, or even a series of commitments throughout your Dharma life. Perhaps you need to be even recommitting quite regularly to that. Or it won't really work if you do that. You'll be like me, you know, when I was 13 3/4, I was dabbling and messing about. It was all very interesting, but I hadn't made a commitment. So this commitment that people make in Buddhism is entirely voluntary. There's absolutely no pressure. No one expects you to do it. It's got to come from you. You've got to want to do it. Otherwise, it won't work. If somebody's sort of pressurizing you into it in some kind of way, it won't work. In my own case, I'd been brought up as a Christian, and I was really fed up with it by the time I was about 11, I think, because I was obliged to be one. And I wasn't one. You know, I was even in the choir, the church choir, but that's because I was in love with Miss Forbes, who ran that choir. And that was the only reason that I actually really went there. She didn't even notice me, actually. But yeah, you decide for yourself. No one expects you to do it. It's got to come from you. Okay, so I've got a favourite quote on commitments, and it comes from a Scottish mountaineer in the Second World War. And he was a Himalayan climber. He tried to get up Everest before Tenzing and Hillary, but he didn't manage it. His name was William Hutchinson Murray, Scottish climber. And this is from his book, The Scottish Himalayan Expedition, 1951. Here we go. Until there is commitment, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans. That the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favour all manner of unforeseen incidents and meetings and material assistance, which no man could have dreamt would have come his way. I learned a deep respect for one of Goethe's couplets. Whatever you can do or dream you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. So that little last bit was from Goethe's Faust, for the philosophers among you. Yeah, That's my favorite quote on commitment. So the moment you make a decision about something, the universe starts to kind of get behind you. That's definitely been my experience in all sorts of areas. Well, there's absolutely no difficulty in finding commitment in the life of the Buddha. In fact, if you're giving a talk on commitment in the life of the Buddha, it's quite difficult because there's so much. I mean, what are you going to choose? And so I've only chosen 3 areas. And I know you'll say, oh, but what about so-and-so? Yeah, I know. And his life was one long series of amazing commitments. But I've had to boil it down to just 3, which feels wrong almost. But they're really important ones. They're really good ones. So the first one is called the going forth. And that's about Gautama's dissatisfaction with his life in the palace. So Gautama is the person who became the Buddha, and we'll call him Gautama at this stage. And as you know, he grew up in what we'd call like a palace. He was in something like the royal family. His father was a chieftain in northern India 2,500 years ago, but he was really fed up with it, as we all know. He found it quite meaningless. And, that became a real problem for him. He was trying to solve the meaning of life. So I've got a picture of it here. So you can see. There he is, complete with 70s moustache. So there's the Buddha going forward. There he is. He's kind of his horse, Kantika, led away by his faithful retainer, Chandika. So he's gone off into the forest. He's left his home, his family. He realized that his family would be very well cared for if he left home. And he's cutting off his hair. And quite a lot led up to this point. It's a very, very big, significant point in the life of the Buddha because, well, he was looking for the answer to the problems of life, the problem of old age, the problem of sickness, and the problems of death. And they're things that we just can't get away from. And it became a burning desire for him. The endless round of entertainment and luxury in the 4 different pleasure palaces that he was living in, it just had bored him. He was no longer finding meaning in that kind of way of life. So he decided to leave. We call this the going forth. That's the term we use in Buddhism. So he's cutting off his hair. And that's really, really big deal in the aristocratic society of India 2,500 years. If you can cut your hair off, that was a very, very major deal. I know hair grows back, but the idea is you wouldn't be growing it back. You were really, really putting yourself outside just ordinary, regular society. So I don't think we've really got an equivalent in our own society of that act that he did. And of course, he was completely on his own. He didn't know what he was doing. All he had was this deep intuition, which led to a deep commitment to find the path to enlightenment, or the deathless, as he called it, where there was no death, as it were. And of course, he found it. So the whole of his early life was leading up to this great moment. And so we don't really know how old he was. He was probably, in his 20s. We don't really know. We can't really know. But there are wonderful accounts of this in the scriptures. It's all quite dramatic, really. I'd like to also read you an account of Sangharakshita's going forth. So he's the teacher that founded our movement. And back in the 40s, he was wandering around India, an Englishman, with another Indian, and they decided that they would go forth as well, just like the Buddha, in the same sort of way. So I've got a little reading about that from here in his autobiography, The Rainbow Road, which is a wonderful, wonderful read. It really is. So here we go. We would renounce the household life and go forth into the life of homelessness as wanderers in search of truth. Now, casting aside all fear, we would plunge boldly in. Having made this resolution, we lost no time in putting it into effect. With the help of a handful of Geru Mata, the reddish-brown earth used since time immemorial by Indian ascetics, we dyed our shirts and sarongs, the traditional saffron of the world renunciant. Suitcases and watches were sold, trousers, jackets, and shoes given away, identification papers destroyed. Apart from the robes that we were to wear, we kept only a blanket, each, and our books and notebooks. As for the last 3 months, hair and beard had been allowed to grow, so we did not need shaving tackle. Next morning, after joyfully donning our saffron robes, we walked feeling shy and rather conspicuous through the bazaar. Tibetan Buddhists believe that the appearance of a rainbow is one of the most auspicious signs, and the biographies of their saints and yogis are replete with references to this phenomenon. Whether our going forth on 18th of August 1947 may be considered an auspicious event, I cannot say, but it was certainly signalized by the appearance not of one, but of scores of rainbows. As we left Kusali, it was raining, but as in the course of our descent, we emerged from the clouds into the bright sunshine below. We saw arching the road at intervals of a few dozen yards, not only single, but double and triple rainbows. Every time we turned a bend, we found more rainbows waiting for us. We passed through them as though through multicolored arcades of some celestial palace. Against the background of bright sunshine, jewel-like glittering raindrops, and hills of the freshest and most vivid green. This plethora of delicate, seven-hued bows seemed like the epiphany of another world. Well, it's all quite beautiful and dramatic, isn't it? I'm afraid to say, my entering an antique shop on Spring Road doesn't really sort of compare. But for me, it didn't matter. The meaning was just the same. That was definitely the point where I'd made a commitment. And well, it might be the same for you. In terms of our own life and our own going forth, it doesn't need to be dramatic in any way. It can happen in all sorts of ways. We might make an offering to the shrine in a puja. We might decide to ask to be a mitra. We might go on our first retreat, and that's our going forth. We might make some significant friendships in the Sangha, or perhaps we decide to give some money to the Cambridge Buddhist Centre. Doesn't really matter what it is. The main thing is that you know that that's the point of commitment for you. There's no going back. You've decided you've gone out into the wilderness. You've gone forth. You feel there's something there, an intuition that there's something for you that you want to commit yourself to. So that's what we're talking about. You don't have to cut your hair off or any of that sort of stuff if you have any. You don't have to cut it off. And, yeah, you can. You just need to find your way of doing that. Yeah, so in my case, it was an antique shop. All right, well, I'm going to move on to the second act of commitment of the Buddha, which I'm going to talk about tonight, and that's called the striving. Yeah. There's the Buddha. So he spent quite a lot of years. We don't really know how long he spent. 7 years, 8 years, there are different accounts. We know it was quite a few years in the wilderness. And after he walked away from that wood and left Kantaka, and all the rest of it, he basically set out on a path. And one of the things he did was he sought out some of the eminent spiritual teachers of that particular time and place. And he spent quite a few years meditating under the tutelage of Alara Kalama and Udraka Ramaputra, who were really, really well-known meditation teachers at the time. But he got quite dissatisfied. He actually he plumbed the absolute depths of their spiritual teaching, and he was left wanting. He thought, well, this doesn't solve the problem. Yes, I've got into some exalted states in meditation, but I haven't broken through into the transcendental. It hasn't solved the problem of old age, sickness and death for me. So he left, he moved on, he left them. They were quite keen that he stayed and became a leader of their, but he said, no, there's better work for me to be doing. So one of the things he did was he went off into the jungle and he tried to overcome. He realized that part of the problem of living in the jungle was the fear. He wanted to overcome his fear. And I've spent a certain amount of time in Indian jungles, and I can tell you they are terrifying places. They really, really are, particularly at night. And you know, I had my own encounter with a tiger, and they are. It's not a place you want to go to. But he obviously overcame his fear of the jungle because he spent many years there. And what he was trying to do, he took up the ancient Indian path of extreme ascetic behavior. That means a kind of mortification of the flesh. Yeah, he lived in the roughest possible conditions, quite deliberately as a practice, so that he thought, well, maybe that will lead to an emancipation of the soul, as it were, because there's nothing in the physical experience to go for refuge to. Didn't work. He also met another group of 5 ascetics who were also practicing ridiculous, what they call jutangas, or austerities, standing on one leg for days on end, holding your tongue out, holding your hand in the air for weeks on end, going without sleep, all these crazy things that they were doing. Buddha gave it all up, eventually, as being spiritually useless. He really, really starved himself. He was filthy, with dreadlocks and matted hair. And after a really dramatic event where he nearly lost his life and died, he was very, very lucky in that a local woman, a young woman called Sujata, came across him with some milk rice. I've been to the exact spot in India where the milk rice was delivered by Sujata, and it hasn't really changed. There's a few telegraph poles and tractors and that in the area, but take those away and it looks exactly like it would have done in the time of the Buddha. And I've been to that spot, and it's a really, really significant pilgrimage site, actually, that's often neglected. But she kind of saved his life. And he decided, well, this path of extreme behavior is not working. So he'd also had, of course, lived a life of extreme luxury for many, many years, his early life. So he came up with this teaching of the middle way between the extremes of austerity and the extremes of luxury. He found the middle way, and that's how he progressed. So it's all, once again, all rather dramatic. Of course, after this period, there's the great chapter of the assault by Mara and his defeat of Mara. Mara is the evil one. His name literally means death, who got really interested that the Buddha was moving, that Gautama was moving towards enlightenment, and wanted to prevent that from happening in a spiritual way. Quite terrifying accounts of Mara's hordes and monsters which assailed the Buddha. And you can take that on a mythological level. You can take it how you want to. But he overcame Mara's attack. And, practicing the middle way, practicing the mindfulness of breathing. It said he was doing practice of mindfulness of breathing under the Bodhi tree in the third watch of the night. He broke through, he gained full and perfect enlightenment. And we all know this story so well. Without a deep and total commitment, Gautama would never have achieved it. He'd have failed. He'd never have got there. He wouldn't have overcome the kind of obstacles that he was encountering. He'd probably have either gone back to the palace, or what's more likely, he'd probably have died. And religious history would be completely different. And we wouldn't be sat here. So this has got a resonance for us in our lives, our own following of the path, because we often find following the path difficult enough, don't we? With all our excellent conditions, our comforts that we've got going for us in the modern world, we still find it difficult. And we've got the Buddhist tradition established for thousands of years. It's all there available to us as much as we want. We've got safety, comfort, and we've got the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha to go for refuge to help us. So the path is all laid out for us, but it can still be difficult. So I think we need to be grateful for that, actually. We need to be grateful that we've actually got all that, because without the Buddha's commitment, we wouldn't have it. Because he was completely on his own. He didn't have any idea what he was doing. He was just grasping at straws, but he got there because he was committed. He had no security at all at that time. It was enlightenment or death, I think, for the Buddha. But his striving also reminds us that, well, we have to make an effort. We can't just sort of sit back and let the Cambridge Buddhist Centre or whatever do it for us. Or order members, they're going to actually practice a spiritual life for us. No, it's something that each and every person has to do for themselves. You have to actually make an effort. You can't just be borne along by others. You have to strive. You have to find the middle way for yourself. You have to actually walk the path yourself. And to do that, well, there has to be some commitment there, some kind of commitment, if you're going to make some progress. So finally, the third one. It does seem indecent, doesn't it? There's our money going into 3, but you know, there are restrictions. One mark sheet, and that is the Buddha's commitment shown in his lifelong practice and teaching. I really mean lifelong. Perhaps even 50 years. I don't really know. He may well have been practicing and teaching for certainly more than 40 years, but possibly 50 years he was teaching. And when I say teaching, he was teaching every day, all the time. He would teach absolutely anyone. The first actual sermon is reckoned to have taken place at the Deer Park in Sarnath. Once again, quite a few of us have actually been there, near Varanasi in northern India. It's a big shrine there now where he actually taught he first taught the 5 ascetics, his whole big old friends. And he taught them the middle way, he taught them the 4 noble truths, and he taught them the noble eightfold path. And these 5 ascetics gained enlightenment quite quickly. So by the end of the rainy season, which is usually reckoned to be 3 months in India, more than 60 disciples are said to have become enlightened. That's just his first 3 months. It's pretty good going, I think. So he was active right from the start, straight away, straight to do that. Having walked to Varanasi, which is quite a long way, the rest of his life teaching is pretty well documented in the Pali Canon. There's so many suttas about the places where he taught and what he said on those occasions. So for decades and decades, he spent the rainy season, 3 months, in Shravasti, in Anathapindika's park, deer park. And you can go there and see where he taught and where he lived in the deer park, Anathapindika's park. And usually on retreat with thousands of monks and nuns during his life. The rest of the year, he just wandered on foot, hundreds of miles across northern India. Just hundreds, and he met all sorts of people. Some people didn't want to know him, but mostly they did. And he just walked all over what's called the Gangetic Plain. And he would teach to anyone who would listen. And a lot of people were listening. They were open, they were listening to him. Monks and nuns of different traditions, so-called holy men, lay women, laymen, farmers, field laborers, right through all social strata, right up to kings and queens. They all considered the Buddha to be their teacher. They really respected him and really listened to what he said. He converted robbers, thieves, prostitutes, and at least one serial killer. He converted them, and many of those people gained full and perfect enlightenment. So day after day, for at least 40 years, possibly 50 years, he tirelessly practiced with his disciples. He meditated, he reflected, he practiced ritual, he engaged in spiritual friendship, he led retreats, and of course he taught. It's taught and taught and taught. The content of his voluminous teaching is what we now call the Pali Canon. And countless men and women have travelled that path since the death of the Buddha and right up to the modern day people. So you could say the Buddha is still teaching this even now. So he was deeply committed to Dharma practice and Dharma teaching. And he taught as many people as possible. And he enjoined his own disciples to teach deeply and widely right from the start. So right up to the moment of his death, even, he was teaching. And there's this famous account of a man called Subhadra, who approached the Buddha and wanted a teaching. The Buddha was dying, and Ananda said, no, come on, look, the Buddha's, look, he's on his deathbed here, mate. Come on, you can't do that. And the Buddha overheard, said, no, bring him in, bring in Subhadra, we'll have it. And he gave him a teaching and set Subhadra on the path. And then he died. And the last words of the Buddha were, before he died, with mindfulness, strive on. With mindfulness, strive on. So he was deeply committed to the liberation of all beings, whoever, wherever they were. And his dispensation is still rolling on today. So the big point for us here, I think, that we can take from the Buddha's commitment to this lifelong practice and teaching is a profound one. Because when we practice the Dharma, it's not just for us. Yeah, we're not just benefiting ourselves when we practice the Dharma. We're actually benefiting lots of other people as well. So many people will benefit from your practice of the Dharma because you'll become a better person. You'll be more loving. You'll be more mindful, more compassionate. You'll become wiser. You practice the Dharma. You'll have more energy than you had before. You'll be more ethical, and that means people can trust you. You'll be more helpful to other people. And that will affect those people that are close to you. They'll really get the benefit of your practice. But also it'll affect colleagues at work, relatives, acquaintances, even sometimes strangers in your life will be affected by your Dharma practice. Just by being who you are. Yeah, you're not necessarily teaching or anything like that, but that may happen later on. But just by being who you are in the Dharma will have an effect on the world. So you may never become a formal teacher in the way that I am, but nonetheless, your practice will have an effect, positive effect in itself, will communicate itself to others in how you live your life. And it will do that in 1,000 different ways. So like the Buddha, this will only really come about if you make a commitment to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So I'm going to end the talk with a little poem. We'll have a little bit of time left over for a bit of chat, a bit of discussion. So here's my short poem. And there was a Japanese hermit monk in 18th century Japan who was deeply committed to the Buddha, and he lived in a little bamboo hut in the middle of the forest. His name was Ryokan. He wrote very, very beautiful poems with brush on paper. So he's talking about the Buddha here. He calls him Shakyamuni, which was the clan name of the Buddha, but he's talking about the Buddha. Okay, so I'll finish with this poem. Even if a man lives 100 years, his life is like a floating weed, drifting with the waves, east and west continually, no time for rest. Shakyamuni renounced nobility and devoted his life to preventing others from falling into ruin. On the earth, 80 years, proclaiming the Dharma for 50, bestowing the sutras as an eternal legacy. Today, still a bridge to cross over to the other shore. Okay.